Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. We may step on a few toes through our examination of culture, art, politics, history, and identity. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
Sigel, I'm John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native. I've got to do a review of Killers of the Flower Moon, the movie, but I can't talk about the movie without talking about the book. So let me first come right out of the gate and just say it. You should see this movie. You should see the movie. I'm not saying you must, but you should see the movie. If you have any concern about social justice or any sense of responsibility for history, then you should see this movie. So I say that without hesitation. However, the movie is not the book. And while I've heard other people review about how closely the movie tracks the book, I don't agree. I don't think the movie tracks with the book nearly enough, and I'm going to get into some of that. But let me say, I watched the film in New York City. I was down in the city for its opening weekend. I went to the 10:15 show at the Regal Theater on 42nd Street. The 10:15 show was what they called an RPX theater, which meant Regal Premium Experience, which means it was loud. I mean really loud. And the screen was huge. I entered the theater being the only one in there. I think maybe 3 or 4 other people showed up in the theater. So there I am in this, what almost feels like an exclusive screening in New York City for a city that never sleeps. Apparently catching a 10:15 show, which really didn't start for another half hour, and a movie that is 3.5 hours long. Apparently New York City does sleep. And although I think the box office sales have been pretty high on the film, it felt strange to be in a theater that was almost empty. And of course, being almost empty, I wasn't distracted by any other oohs and ahs from a crowd. Like I said, the film was in this theater environment was very, very loud, so I didn't miss much. And of course, like I said, the screen was very big. I gotta say, the film clearly was created, written around the stars of the film, Robert De Niro and Leonardo DiCaprio. The book did not just center on those guys, and the book did track the FBI investigation of the murders that took place, but it also talked about the scale of the murders and the theft and all that other stuff. Something that I thought the film failed to do. It failed to really communicate to its audience how many people were really killed. And look, when the FBI was investigating it, they were looking at about maybe 25, 30 murders. But the fact of the matter is they ignored hundreds more. And this reign of terror that is what is described in this thing, which they claim was from about 1923 to about 1925 or so, was actually much bigger than that. The murders started before the 1920s, and they went into the 1930s. So there was over a decade, maybe a decade and a half of these murders that took place, and various other crimes. So and these murders range from everything from just hijacking Osage people who were driving about town or walking or whatever else, to committing all sorts of murders. Now, one would expect that although the book and the investigation by the FBI centered around the murders of Molly Burkhart's sisters or family members and that kind of stuff, and what the FBI tried to do was try to narrow the scope of this investigation and focus on what they hoped they could nail down as a small group of people perpetrating these crimes with a mastermind and the whole bit. That was the goal, and that's actually what the film did. The film actually tracked more along the lines of the narrow scope that the FBI took than the broader scope that David Grann took in the book in Killers of the Flower Moon, and that's that was disappointing. There's one thing that I think the film did that the book didn't do. And in fact, when I interviewed David Grann, I asked him, why did you guys mention the Tulsa riots, the Tulsa massacres, I should say? And he said it was an oversight. It was a mistake. And since then, I know that David Grann, and as well as Martin Scorsese and De Niro and DiCaprio have talked about this. And I was wondering, I was curious if it would make it in the film, and it did. It mentioned it kind of as a news flash, but also a cry at the when one of the murders involved blowing up a house. One of the cries was that this was like Tulsa, or Tulsa all over again, or something like that. So I'm glad for the reference, although the reason for bringing up the Tulsa massacre, it was to again expand and to unsilo what was happening in Osage territory as far as these murders based on racism and white supremacy and all that stuff, but to kind of demonstrate how broad this white supremacy and racism really was. And so it mentions it, but it doesn't connect as much as it should have, as far as I was concerned. Like I said, I think it's important that people see the film so they understand what took place as far as the Osage were concerned. I think it is really important. But you have to understand that this is a film adaptation of a book that is essentially a really good work of investigative journalism. I mean, David Grann spent years researching and went well beyond the FBI's investigation. And in fact, David Grann went at length to criticize the narrow scope of the FBI investigation. So anybody who says, "Well, it's a good thing that they went away from the book a little bit," and I've heard some people allege that the book was about white hero syndrome, and I didn't get that at all. In fact, I thought David Grann again went at length to show the failure of the FBI, some of the the manipulation that came all the way from J. Edgar Hoover down to Tom White, who was the agent investigating, and what they essentially chose to ignore or not bring into this thing. So anybody who believes that the FBI came in, solved a murder, and ended the reign of terror is just wrong. The murders continued on for at least another 5 or 6 years, if not longer. And it was hundreds, maybe 2, maybe 3. It's almost hard to know. If you look at the real records of the rolls of the Osage, you realize that in this period of 16 years, there were like 600 or 700 people who died, which was way over the top of the national average. And you have to remember that these were affluent people. Usually affluence means that you don't die at an early age. But the Osage were dying, their average life expectancy was in the 50s, while white people were living to the 70s. So it wasn't, some of the stuff didn't get exposed by the film. The other thing that didn't get exposed was the scale, not just of the murders, but of the thievery and how broad-based it was, how it touched every segment of the white society that was embedded with the Osage. Everything from the doctors and the lawyers, the law enforcement, the private investigators, the storekeepers, and of course, many of whom would play a role as the guardians of the Osage, because the Osage were being regarded as incapable of managing this wealth that had come upon them. But these guardians were thieves as well. And see, and the film didn't really cover that. It didn't really, I mean, it talked about how the guardians were scrutinizing the spending, but it didn't talk about how they were pocketing money. So I was disappointed. Look, I fully anticipated that this film would be a great film, although I knew it wasn't going to be accurate. I could tell that just from seeing the trailers. The fact that they were centering it around the Leonardo DiCaprio character, and he played Ernest Burkhart, who was the nephew of William Hale, who was in the movie portrayed as the mastermind, essentially, of all the murders, but he probably wasn't. I mean, he was certainly a deviant psychopath, as was Ernest Burkhart. But they didn't play Burkhart as a psychopath. No, they played him as somebody who was conflicted between the love for his wife and his love for money. And the book doesn't really paint that picture. The film does. And in fact, the film actually places Ernest Burkhart in many of the other crimes. Everything from, like I said, hijacking people roadside, grave robbing, and the book doesn't necessarily allege that, or assume that. So, in order to give, I guess, DiCaprio more screen time and to show, the juxtaposition of his deviant behavior versus his affection for his wife, which there's no evidence that was even true. There was no evidence that Ernest Burkhart was madly in love with his wife, or that Molly was madly in love with him. Because here's the thing. The Osage couldn't control their own money. It is entirely possible that the reason as many Osage women who married white men did so they hoped that their white husbands could be granted the guardianship so they could have access to more of their money. In a way, there may have been a certain play being made by the Osage women who you can't assume were ignorant or incompetent. And in fact, I think Lily Gladstone's portrayal of Molly Burkhart demonstrated real flashes of brilliance. But there was also the sense that she was gullible and that she was blinded by the love for her husband, which may or may not have been true. She'd been married multiple times throughout her life. I mean, she may not have been this easily infatuated woman. She may have been a pragmatist with her relationships, and so many of the other women may have been. Now, the film also suggests that it was the money, the oil wealth, that had destroyed the culture of the Osage. I mean, the film opens in almost, I got to tell you, in almost a Jed Clampett scenario where somebody's hunting for some food, and up through the ground came a bubbling crude. Then they show Native people in very stereotypical imagery dancing under a shower of crude oil spraying up out of the ground. It goes from that to now showing the wealth that the Osage accumulated. Like, you could see that once they got showered with oil, literally, according to the film, they became these very, very assimilated, wealthy, Osage, and yet still seem to lack sophistication, according to the film. The book doesn't necessarily say that. And look, and I have to remind people that, out of this did come, some people who use that wealth, in a manner to improve their lives and to demonstrate their level of sophistication, education-wise. Maria Tallchief is actually regarded as the United States or America's first prima ballerina. Her and her sister were very accomplished ballet dancers. Now, that probably wouldn't have happened without, having a dance school and a dance theater and all that stuff right there in Osage territory. But this woman, Maria, traveled the world as this prima ballerina. So to suggest that we were unsophisticated, or that the Osage, rather, were so unsophisticated and needed to have these white men be their guardians of their wealth, who were anything but, belies the truth. And I think Maria Tallchief is an example of somebody who did show a level of not only of incredible skill and talent, but sophistication. So, I mean, those are the things that concern me. Now, I think the film does demonstrate that there was murder, that there were murders going on, and that there were that these murders were happening with the explicit intention of stealing the oil wealth. But again, the film does very much what the FBI tried to do: paint the picture all around William Hale and Ernest Burkhart, and their cadre of psychopaths that their gang, if you want to call it that. But they also tried to suggest that William Hale was responsible for all of the murders, which he, again, according to David Grant's book, he suggests that can't be true. There were murders that you could not necessarily connect to certainly to Burkhart and or William Hale. So I think the film does the historical record a little bit of an injustice, and frankly, I think it does the book a little injustice. And rather than really centering the story around not just Molly Burkhart, but her sisters, most of whom were killed. I think they could have done more with that. And look, Leonardo DiCaprio originally was going to play the role of the FBI agent. I think he should have. I think he could have done much to expand the depth of that character. Both as an actor, but as a screenwriter and his involvement with the screenwriting. I don't think he had to convince an audience to have somewhat sympathy for the conscience that Ernest Burkhart had. And that's what he chose to do. He chose to play this tormented villain, rather. And they argued that the reason they did this was because they didn't want to come across as promoting this white hero trope that is often done with movies, whether they're based on true stories or not. But I don't think that Tom White, the FBI agent, was necessarily a hero either. I think his failures on so many levels throughout the investigation should have been pointed out, and the fact that he may have been tormented by what he had to ignore versus what he had to investigate, because he was having J. Edgar Hoover breathe heavily down his neck. So I think the same film could have been based on this book and been portrayed completely different, and I think it should have. I think it's unfortunate that they didn't give Molly Burkhart, the Lily Gladstone character, more intelligence and more of an opportunity to demonstrate her own cynicism towards not just somebody like William Hale, but even towards her husband. So you have to remember that every piece of dialogue in the film was made up. It's a scriptwriter who came up with that dialogue. There's no record of that dialogue. So every dialogue, every conversation, every intimate moment is a fabrication. It's creative license. Now, I got to tell you, I knew that was going to be the case going in, but I thought the movie would be better. I honestly thought, I think De Niro played, the role that was, put out there for De Niro to play, I think was done well. I just don't think that the way they recast the Ernest Burkhart character in the screenplay was fair. I don't think it was accurate. And I'm not saying DiCaprio didn't play that character well, but that character is probably not a true character. And there's no evidence from the book to suggest that this was this torn, love-struck individual who was conflicted between the love for his wife and wanting to murder her family. In fact, spoiler alert, the suggestion that Ernest Burkhart didn't know he was poisoning his own wife is kind of an absurd proposition, given everything else that the movie alleges he was involved in, which is more than what the book alleges he was involved in. And we could also, be concerned that Ernest Burkhart does become the hero of the story because he turns around and testifies against his uncle, making him essentially the linchpin for the convictions. So as much as Scorsese claims that he didn't want to do that, I think he did do that. And that's the problem that I have with the film. But again, let me say it for one more time. I think it's really important that people see the film. But more important, it would be great if anybody who sees the film does some of their own homework. There are other documentaries. There are other stories that can be told of this. Read the book. Read The Killers of the Flower Moon. To me, it's almost a shame that the movie bears the same name, because it is, in my estimation, a pretty good departure from what David Grann had done. And his research is really extensive. And I think that I honestly think that the movie does not do the book justice. But I know because of the A-list actors and, the big names like Scorsese, De Niro and DiCaprio in the film, I think it will draw a broader public to have some awareness of the story. My concern is that it may bring a bunch of people in to learn something about the Osage murders, but it's also going to make people make assumptions because it's a movie, and they're going to make assumptions that Ernest Burkhart only acted out of fear of his uncle. There's nothing to suggest that was true. And so I think that there's a real problem with the way they recrafted this, this character of Ernest Burkhart in the film, and I think it really does depart in a big way from from the book. So while I want people to go see this film, I think it's really important that people do. I also think that that if you are interested, you should go further than the film. You should read the book. Check out. I think Greg Palast has a piece that he's done on this thing. There's a lot of other. I mean, there's a bigger story than an FBI investigation and a conviction. I mean, because the murders continued after that, and of course, the oil wealth, would go on even as oil companies would go out of business and that kind of stuff. It doesn't mean that oil men didn't use that profit to start the very oil companies that exist today. So I think understanding the long-term consequences of this stuff, including, look, when you're talking about many Osage women and some Osage men who took on white spouses, I think you have to understand that you actually changed literally the complexion of the Osage. Think about all those children who didn't have a mother because they were killed or marginalized or stricken with some mysterious illness. So they didn't get the culture. They didn't get the benefit of having the mother teach them the culture. They were raised by white men who were only in these fraudulent relationships for the money. The other thing that I have to mention is there's no suggestion that the Osage had been impacted by residential schools, the Indian boarding school era. And of course, if you're going to assume that it's the money that made their culture somehow, be erased, you're forgetting that there was already 2 generations of Osage, as well as people all across the U.S. and Canada, that were being imprisoned, not just people, children that were being imprisoned in these boarding schools. I mean, you watch the film and you assume, oh, they're all Christian. Well, how'd they get there? Oil didn't make them Christians. The residential schools did. So for a film that is 3.5 hours long, they sure did dance around issues that would have been more significant to the story. What led up to the time when oil was discovered? I mean, what was the impact of being moved? That's not even made very clear. Being moved from Missouri. So there are things that don't make a whole lot of sense. Of course, after 3 hours, you may not be looking for more information. But when you understand how repetitive some of that film was for 3.5 hours, you realize that they could have done more. They could have talked about the impact of residential schools and forced relocation. And you could have talked about what happened to the oil wealth. Where do the Osage sit now? And there's almost none of that. And of course, you also learn that there wasn't much in the way of convictions. There wasn't much in the way of prosecutions. There were hundreds of murders that took place, at least 200 or 300, but it may have been more than that. And that's not what the FBI was investigating. Nope, they wanted to look at this as a serial killing being perpetrated by an individual or an individual and his henchmen. And that's the way they investigated the crime. And frankly, it's the way Scorsese cast the film. And to me, that's unfortunate. See the film, but understand that much of what you're watching is a fabrication done under this notion of creative license to make a film that will be appealing to a broader segment of society, perhaps. But I got to tell you, I think Scorsese, De Niro, and DiCaprio could have done this film better. And going in expecting that I would be troubled by some of what the film would do, I didn't know that I'd go in and be disappointed at what the film does do. I'm John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native, Yahweh.